There is a version of you that makes decisions before you even realize a decision is being made. It happens quickly, almost invisibly. You are in a conversation and someone expects something from you, a response, an agreement, a particular kind of answer. And before your actual thoughts can form, something else takes over, something faster, something older. You give the expected answer. Not because it is true, not because it is what you want, but because it feels safer than the alternative. This is not weakness. It is not a character flaw. It is something that happens to almost everyone in almost every ordinary moment of a day, at work, in relationships, in the small choices about how to present yourself to the world. But here is what is worth sitting with. If most of your decisions are made in response to what others might think, then whose life are you actually living? That question is not meant to alarm you. It is meant to open something. Because the answer, for most people, is more complicated than they expected. She had always been good at reading the room. It was something she developed early, this quiet skill of sensing what the people around her needed and adjusting accordingly. In meetings, she would wait to see which direction the group was leaning before she offered her own perspective. With friends, she was rarely the first to suggest where to eat, what to do, what to feel. In her relationship, she had become fluent in a kind of emotional translation, turning what she actually felt into something more palatable, more manageable, less likely to cause tension. She would have described herself as easygoing, considerate, someone who did not like to cause problems. And for a long time, she believed that was simply who she was. It usually looks like this, a small moment at work, unremarkable on the surface. Her manager presents a plan during a team meeting. She can see immediately that there is a gap in the logic, a detail that has been overlooked, something that will cause problems later. She has the thought clearly. She knows the right thing to say. But then something happens beneath the surface. A fast, quiet calculation. What if she is wrong and embarrasses herself? What if her manager takes it personally? What if the team thinks she is being difficult? What if this moment, this one small moment of honesty, costs her something she cannot quite name? She says nothing. Or she says something so softened, so carefully wrapped in qualifications, that the actual point dissolves before it reaches anyone. She watches the meeting move forward. The gap remains. And she returns to her desk with a feeling she does not examine, something between relief and a quiet, distant dissatisfaction. This happens on a Tuesday, and a Thursday, and the following week and the week after that. Each time the decision feels individual, context-specific, reasonable. She tells herself she is choosing her battles. She tells herself it is not the right moment. She tells herself that she will speak up when it really matters. She does not notice that it is always the moment before speaking up that does not feel like the right one. What she is feeling in those moments of silence is not peace. It resembles peace. It has the shape of relief. But underneath it there is something else, a faint tension that does not fully release. A kind of breath that never quite finishes. She would not describe it as fear. Fear is for things that are genuinely dangerous. A difficult conversation at work, an honest opinion offered quietly, these are not dangerous things. She knows that intellectually. And yet the body responds before the intellect can intervene. The throat tightens slightly. The words rearrange themselves. The version of her that speaks becomes a managed version, careful, measured, pleasant. And then comes the aftermath. Not guilt exactly, not regret, something softer than both. a low, familiar feeling of having been slightly absent from her own life, as if she watched herself through glass, performed the expected gestures, and then returned home to someone she has been slowly losing track of. She drives home that evening and cannot quite locate what she is feeling. She is not upset. Nothing bad happened. The meeting was fine. Her manager seemed pleased. And yet there is this residue, thin but persistent, like the aftertaste of a conversation that was technically successful but privately hollow. She turns the radio on, then off, then on again. There is a particular kind of fatigue that comes not from doing too much, but from performing too carefully for too long. It does not announce itself as exhaustion. It arrives as a kind of flatness, a slight graying of the day's edges, the feeling of having been present and absent at the same time. You have probably felt this before, not necessarily in the same situation, but in some version of it. That particular quality of silence that is not chosen, it is defaulted into. That version of yourself that shows up when you sense the possibility of disapproval and quietly takes over. It shows up in small, almost invisible ways. The email rewritten 3 times until it sounds agreeable. The opinion offered as a question. The boundary that becomes a suggestion. The feeling disguised as a preference. And what makes it hard to see is precisely how reasonable it all looks. She is not lying. She is not being false in any obvious way. She is simply editing, continuously, in real time, removing the edges before they have a chance to become friction. The strange part is that it does not feel like avoidance in the moment. It feels like maturity. It feels like restraint. It feels sometimes like kindness. And this is where it gets uncomfortable. Because what feels like consideration for others is sometimes, underneath, a deep discomfort with being seen as difficult, wrong, or unwanted. The two things look nearly identical from the outside. Only one of them leaves you feeling present in your own life. Step back from this particular Tuesday, this particular meeting, this particular moment of held breath. Because this is not really about a meeting. This pattern, this tendency to reshape what is felt and thought into what is safe to express, does not begin in adulthood. It does not begin at a workplace. It begins much earlier, in smaller rooms with higher stakes. In the years when being accepted by the people around you was not a preference but something closer to a survival need. The child who learns that calm in the household depends on agreement. The teenager who discovers that belonging requires a certain kind of performance. The young adult who finds that being liked means being manageable, being predictable, being easy. The strategies developed then were intelligent. They worked. They protected something. But here is what most people don't notice about those early strategies. They were built for a specific environment, calibrated to a particular set of people, a particular kind of threat. And then life moved on. The rooms got larger. The stakes changed. The people changed. The strategies did not. They kept running quietly in the background, not because the person chose to keep them, but because they were never examined. Because examining them would have required sitting with a question that felt too large. What would happen if I stopped? What if they did not like it? What if being fully honest cost something? And so the pattern continued, not dramatically, just persistently. Each small managed moment feeling individual, reasonable, context-specific, adding up over years into a life shaped more by avoidance than by actual choice. But strategies that are never examined tend to outlive their usefulness. They become automatic. They begin operating not in response to actual danger, but in response to the mere suggestion of disapproval, the mere possibility that someone might think less of you. And the self, the actual self, with its actual thoughts and feelings and preferences, starts to shrink into the space that is left over. Part of you already knows this. Some version of this recognition has visited you before, maybe briefly, in a quiet moment after a conversation where you said the expected thing instead of the true thing, where you left feeling slightly hollow without being able to name why. There is a name for the shape that forms over a lifetime of managing yourself for others, and understanding that shape is where something begins to shift. Carl Jung spent much of his work exploring a fundamental division that exists inside the human psyche, the split between who we show the world and who we actually are. He called the outward-facing version the persona, the mask. Not in a cynical sense, the persona is not deception. It is a genuine and necessary part of social life. Everyone wears one. The question is not whether you have a persona, but how much of yourself you have left behind it. What sits on the other side of the persona, the feelings, the impulses, the honest reactions that cannot fit inside the acceptable version of the self, Jung called the shadow. Not a dark or shameful thing, though it can carry shame. Simply the part of you that has been pushed out of sight because at some point it did not feel safe to show. For many people, the shadow holds something ordinary but powerful, the capacity to disappoint, the willingness to be disliked, the ability to say something that might not land well, the comfort with being misunderstood. These are not dramatic qualities, but for someone who has spent years managing their external presentation, they feel almost forbidden. Picture a moment where someone asks your honest opinion and something in you already knows, before you have finished forming the thought, what kind of answer will be received well. The assessment happens so quickly it barely registers as a choice. And what emerges is the acceptable version, not the full one. That is the persona doing its work, efficiently, automatically, with no malicious intent. And so when a moment arrives, a meeting, a relationship, a quiet afternoon decision, and the authentic response would carry any risk of disapproval, the persona moves automatically. It smooths the edges. It translates. It protects. But protection always has a cost. Jung observed that the more energy a person puts into maintaining the persona, the more they lose access to the deeper, truer self underneath it. Not because the self disappears, it does not, but because the distance between the two grows large enough that the person begins to feel slightly unreal to themselves, present in their own life but not quite inhabiting it. This is not dramatic, it is quiet. It shows up as that low, persistent feeling of going through the motions, of being agreeable and exhausted at the same time, of choosing correctly by every visible measure and still feeling, privately, that something is missing. Jung also observed something else, that the shadow does not simply disappear when it is ignored. It accumulates. It finds other ways to surface, in sudden irritability that seems disproportionate, in the resentment that builds quietly toward people who seem to say what they think without consequence, in the vague sense that other people are living more directly than you are. The fear of rejection does not announce itself. It operates through the persona, quietly shaping what gets expressed, what gets suppressed, and over time, what gets forgotten entirely. This is not unique to her. It is not unique to any particular kind of person, any specific background, any particular role. Imagine this: you are in a conversation with someone you care about. They say something you disagree with genuinely, clearly. And in the pause before your response, something happens. A calculation you did not consciously initiate. You measure the distance between what you actually think and what will keep the peace. You feel briefly the shadow of possible disapproval. And then you speak, and what you say is close to the truth but softened, qualified, safe. Afterwards, the conversation moves forward. No tension, no difficulty, and somewhere below the surface, something small contracts. You tell yourself it was not worth the argument. You tell yourself it did not really matter. Both of those things might even be true. But the pattern underneath them is still worth looking at, because not every instance of that calculation is about something trivial. Some of them are about things that genuinely matter to you, and the same mechanism runs through all of them, treating the important ones and the minor ones with the same automatic response. This happens across relationships, across workplaces, across the quiet interior of a person's daily choices. It happens in people who appear confident. It happens in people who are genuinely kind. It happens in people who have built entire reputations on their certainty, only to discover in private that they are still quietly performing. Because the fear of rejection is not really about what other people will do. It is about what rejection has come to mean internally, about worth, about belonging, about whether you are allowed to take up space in a particular way. When that fear is in control, it does not feel like fear. It feels like preference. It feels like tact. It feels like good judgment. And most people never look at it directly, not because they are incapable, but because the persona has been doing its job so thoroughly for so long that looking becomes unfamiliar. There is a kind of loyalty that forms toward the version of yourself you have been presenting. Questioning it feels like a betrayal of expectations, of relationships, of a self-image that has been carefully maintained. And that is the uncomfortable part, because the persona does not just protect you from others, it protects you from yourself, from the knowledge of how many choices have been quietly shaped by the desire to remain acceptable. Or maybe it appears differently for you. Maybe it is not silence, it is excessive explanation. Maybe it is not agreement, it is performance of certainty. Maybe it shows up as always being the one who smooths things over, who keeps the group comfortable, who makes sure no one leaves feeling bad. The shape changes. The architecture underneath stays the same. There is no dramatic reversal available here. No single conversation that repairs everything. No insight that, once encountered, dissolves the pattern overnight. Jung did not promise that either. What he offered was something quieter, the idea that awareness itself is a form of movement. That noticing the persona, catching it in motion, recognizing it as a layer rather than as the whole self, begins, incrementally, to change the relationship between the mask and the face beneath it. This is what he meant by individuation, not the elimination of the persona, not the decision to say everything you think in every situation, regardless of consequence, but the slow, uneven process of developing enough interior space that the authentic self does not have to completely disappear every time the situation feels risky. It is less dramatic than it sounds. It does not look like a confrontation. It does not require a declaration. It looks like a pause, a moment before the managed response forms where something is briefly seen, where the gap between what was felt and what was said becomes visible, not wide enough yet to step through, but present enough to register. The woman in that meeting is not broken. She is not failing. She is doing what a large part of herself learned to do to remain safe in a world where acceptance once felt like it depended on her performance. But she is also slowly beginning to notice the gap between the response she gave and the thought she had before it, between the version of herself she offered and the version that remained quietly behind it. And noticing changes something, not immediately, not cleanly, but it introduces a small amount of friction into a process that used to be entirely seamless, and friction in the right place is where movement begins. That noticing is not dramatic. It does not produce immediate resolution, but it is not nothing. You might try noticing this next time, not changing the outcome necessarily, just pausing long enough to see the calculation happening, to watch the persona move, to feel where the authentic response was before it was adjusted. Just once sit with the gap. Not to force anything open, not because discomfort is always a sign to push through, but because the self that has been managed and translated and softened for a long time deserves, at some point, to be seen, even just by you. The insight is not, be more honest. The insight is simply this, that there is more of you than what you have been presenting, and you are the only one who has been keeping it out of the room. Fear of rejection does not always look like fear. Sometimes it looks like being reasonable, being flexible, being easy to get along with, until you realize those choices were never fully yours to begin with. Most people will not notice this in themselves immediately. The persona is too practiced. The adjustments are too fast. But there are moments, small, quiet ones, where the distance becomes briefly visible, where you hear yourself say something and feel, in the same instant, that the version of you that just spoke was not quite the whole of it. Those moments are not problems, they are information. Jung believed that the process of becoming more fully yourself, what he called individuation, was not about eliminating the persona or rejecting the need for social belonging. It was about developing enough interior space that the self does not have to disappear inside the mask entirely. It is a slow process, an uneven one. There will be moments of clarity and then long stretches where the old patterns return, feeling as automatic as they ever did. That is not failure. That is how the interior changes, not in one clean motion, but in small, accumulating shifts that are hard to see while they are happening. The woman on that drive home, radio on and then off, is not at the beginning of something dramatic. She is simply a little more awake than she was this morning. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything. But it begins in exactly the kind of moment that passed quietly on a Tuesday, in an ordinary meeting, in an ordinary life, when someone had a thought, felt the pull of approval, and made a choice so fast they almost did not see it happen. Almost.